So welcome everybody to today's expert interview, and we have the lovely dietitian and diabetes educator Kim Connolly with us today to share her wisdom and words of wisdom. And just as a little bit of an introduction, so Kim has a really interesting pathway to this profession of dietetics, not probably very unique. Coming from the Air Force as an officer in the Air Force. So I'm sure some amazing stories. But I recently met Kim at the Low Carb conference in the Gold Coast, and we shared a room and shared lots of common stories about clients and that sort of thing. And that's why I thought it would be fantastic to have her come and join us and share some bits and bobs about her interest areas. So she's really been focused on diabetes and weight loss and all of that sort of stuff, but has a real interest in the brain and how that all ties into nutrition, as well as some autoimmune stuff as well. So I'm looking forward to hearing all about this side of things. So welcome, Kim, and you can tell us, maybe fill in a few gaps there and tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Vicky, for that very lovely introduction. I suppose there's a couple of things that I'm interested in from my dietetic perspective. Firstly, as you know, I do some podcasting as well, so interested in sharing what I learn along the way with others. And I suppose I should mention too that most of my work is in private practice too, so it's dealing with people one-to-one, and yes, some of the biggest issues, as you would be well aware, are getting body weight off, and understanding body weight, and understanding the emotional roller coaster that goes with the ups and downs of body weight. And I suppose my passion really is to understand this phenomenon that only appears to really affect the human race. So it doesn't appear to affect the animal kingdom. So we have to sort of step back and work out what we're doing that's so different, that's allowing our body not to maintain a healthy weight all by itself. So yeah, lots of interest in that, and I'll be the first to put my hand up and say I don't have all the answers, but I'm very curious about them. So yeah, thanks for having me along, and I look forward to having a bit of a chat with you tonight.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I will definitely put links to Kim's website as well as her podcast underneath this, so you can check that all out. And she puts out a new podcast every Monday, and the name of that podcast is Women's Mind Body Health. So you can definitely go and check that out. And her website is dietitiandownunder.com. So the other thing that we were going to speak about is a bit about hormones. This is more for the women in the group here, the menstrual cycles, how our hormones are impacting all sorts of things, our cravings, our ability to fast, our hunger, all sorts of things are impacted. And we were having a little bit of a laugh prior to pressing record here that, there's not much study done on this area, because it's just too damn hard, really, to understand this fluctuating female hormone business and how it impacts just everything. But maybe you can shed a little bit of light on this for us, Kim. So I'll hand over to you.
Sure. Well, it's certainly an area of interest to me as I approach that menopausal phase. I'm just very curious about the weight changes and about the energy changes, and I guess whenever I've thought of menopause, I've thought of hot flushes and those symptoms that are reported. And it's always occurred to me that surely that can't be normal for that to happen to women. And so it was interesting. I was listening to a conversation between, I was actually on another podcast called Low Carb Conversations, which talks about studies and tries to sort of nut out what's good in particular studies that have come out and what's not so good. And Leah Williamson, who runs that podcast, was interviewing on this occasion Professor Grant Schofield and Dr. Karen Zinn. And Grant Schofield and Karen are both at Auckland Uni in New Zealand, and Grant being in public health and Karen being a PhD dietitian. And they have produced, or they're very much working in this low carb space, and they've really led the way for us as dietitians to operate in this low carb space through their knowledge of the evidence and the presentation of that. And they've produced an initial book called What the Fat, and they were there discussing their follow-up book called What the Fast. So they were talking about, you know, the method of fasting that occurs more naturally and as a means of weight loss. And then the conversation sort of turned to female hormones, and I was very fascinated by the fact that Grant knew so much about female hormones, and he was really curious about the you know, their effect on body weight and just on exercise capacity and on cravings and things. And I just had never heard of the female cycle spoken about with this before. But as he was talking about it, I'm going, oh yeah, I recognise that, and the women amongst us might as well. So I sort of took that, and at the same time I was reading a book that I showed you just briefly as well, Vicky, called The Women's Brain Book, because I am very curious about the brain. And the Women's Brain Book by Dr. Sarah McKay, another Australian researcher, was, it started off, and this is what interested, you know, I was very fascinated. I picked it up and read the first few pages, and the first few things she was talking about were women's hormones and the absolute lack of evidence to explain them. And she said, how can we live on this earth for so long, do so many studies, and know nothing about the hormonal cycle apart from the fact that it exists and sort of how it works from a medical model, but not how it impacts our thoughts and our feelings and our hunger and our energy levels. And so I was sort of tying these two bits of information together, because I'd been looking at Sarah's sort of presentation of the women's cycle, and I hadn't paid really that much attention to the women's cycle before, you know, which hormones were up and which were down and at what part of the cycle this happened. But when Craig mentioned about, you know, when estrogen is low and when progesterone is high, you don't have a lot of energy and you have more cravings and things, it certainly piqued my interest. And I thought, well, what happens in menopause? And of course, you lose both of those. You lose relatively similar amounts of estrogen and progesterone. So the way that it works is in that first 14 days or the first 10 days from menstruation to ovulation, your estrogen levels climb relative to your progesterone. So progesterone's still going up a bit, but estrogen's going up much more. So you're estrogen dominant in that first part of the cycle. And the way we interpret that as a sensation is that we are alert and we're on the ball and our brains work very efficiently and we can put in 100% and we can work really hard physically. We can do sprints and we can do cardiovascular workouts and things, and we handle it really well. Now, as estrogen starts to drop around ovulation, and of course that's how ovulation occurs, and progesterone rises relative to estrogen, all of a sudden you get flat and you start to get fatigued and you start to crave sugar and you don't feel like exercising anymore. And if you weren't tracking your cycle, you would be sitting back and going, why am I so lazy? And why do I keep wanting to eat that chocolate and all that sugary thing? And you might, you know, make yourself feel bad and run this cycle of thinking, oh, I'm doing so really well, and I've gone for a run every couple of days this week, and I've done my resistance training, and I'm eating really well, and now I can't do anything. Neither can I even think. So, you know, when I learned this, I went, oh my God, that's me. And it made sense. And the point of it is, if you know where you are on this cycle, you can work really hard when the hormones work with you, and you can chill out a bit when you're in that second phase of the cycle. And that's when you do something seasonally different. So that's when you might read a bit more. It's when you might do yoga and Pilates, or go for a walk along the beach. It's when you might have a little bit more starchy carbs in your diet. And it's about not being so hard on yourself. And, you know, we don't learn this in school, you know, so we just don't have this information to support this really time immemorial cycle that happens. How little do we know that we've gotten this far in 2018 as it is now, and we're only just beginning to understand that this is a phenomenon. So we have a long way to go when it comes to women's health, and that affects us mentally. You know, that sensation of being flat and not being able to focus as well, and you know, all of these things, it plays on us negatively if we don't understand that this is a natural part of a cycle. And then I was thinking too, something Karen Zinn said when she was being interviewed about this relatively low estrogen and being careful of estrogenic compounds. And, you know, as part of my podcasting, I've been doing a bit of research into pesticides, and I'm well aware that many of the pesticides and plastics and sprays we use, you know, to make things waterproof have an estrogenic effect. So they behave as what we call a xenoestrogen, and that's an estrogenic shape that fits into our estrogen receptors and blocks estrogen. So we can get into a relatively low estrogen state if we are exposed to estrogen or hormonal disruptors. And interestingly, as I was doing this research, I watched a webinar that was given by some experts from Harvard. So they do a webinar series on controversies in science, and they had looked at hormone disruptors, and the expert scientists in this field said, the science is very clear. We would have zero tolerance of hormone disruptors if it wasn't so phenomenally business driven. So it is all about the money that is made with the compounds that do disrupt hormones. And a lot of them, BPA, for example, is a really big one. So biphenyl A. And the trouble is that little compound makes an enormous amount of money per second around the world. And as he said, that buys a lot of lawyers. So the only reason we haven't completely ruled them out of our society is they are so useful, and they're an economic, they're of economic value to countries. So the point of this is that they behave like estrogens. So a lot of those compounds are in things like makeup and skincare products. And the people who are most exposed to those are actually teenage girls. They will put on average, something like 26 different products on their selves in a day. So there's an enormous volume. And if they're using cheap skincare products, then they're likely to be full of these estrogen disruptors. And that's going to play havoc with hormonal cycles. And what do you get out of that? When your estrogen is low, you're going to be flat, you're going to crave sugar, and you're not going to want to feel like exercising, and your brain's going to suffer. So, yeah, and thank you for suggesting we talk about this, because I had really missed that. And just going back and listening to that conversation again, I picked it up the second time round, and it's just really brought home to me the consideration for our next generations, because what they're noting is that this is an effect that lasts for several generations. So if you've got one female exposed, that has this epigenetic effect. So it's affecting the genes, and that's then being transferred on to the child of that woman, which is then being transferred on. And they're seeing these single effects down 4 or 5 generations. So, of course, they're looking at animal models, but they're extrapolating to humans on this. So, yeah, it's certainly become an issue of interest, and interestingly, it is an issue of interest in Australia. So, Australia looks at pesticides on foods and things, but recently they've turned their attention to hormone disruptors. And certainly in the US, things like the, I can't remember the name of the organisation now. It'll come to me when I'm not thinking of it. But the organisation that puts out the Dirty Dozen. So it's the environmental watchdog in the US.
Yeah, I'll look it up and I'll put it underneath for everybody.
Yeah, and in fact, the link is fantastic anyway to their organisation, because not only do they highlight the problem, but they show you some solutions, and they try to work with whatever solutions are available. So yes, and they're putting pressure on governments. EWG, the Environmental Working Group, is the organisation in the US, and they're trying to put pressure on politicians and governments, because the science is there. What's not there is the willingness yet to make the change, because it is an economic decision, largely. So yeah, I guess just being aware that these sorts of things may be affecting us as well. So not only do we have hormonal shifts happening as we're hitting perimenopause and menopause, but potentially we've got the effect of our environment catching up with us a bit as well. So there could be a combination sort of effect. So just being cognizant of that in our environment, because many of those chemicals are on our curtains. That's what keeps them waterproof, or on our rugs, or on our furniture. And we're constantly exposed and breathing in this. So I guess the point is, get outside a bit more too.
Good advice. I know. Well, once you start saying it's just everywhere, people will start freaking out. Well, how do we get away from it? But it's about just finding a good balance and getting outside in the great outdoors and doing, some breathing of the fresh air and getting away from those closed environments that we so often find ourselves in these days.
That's right. So doing your best to get out in nature, it is really important. It's important for your vitamin D and the sunlight effect anyway. Yeah, there's lots of reasons. We need sun, we need light. It's part of our physiology. But also, yeah, just as best we can, breathing clean air and working towards those policies that help the environment to remain cleaner. For us, we're not perfect, and we don't need to strive for perfection, but we do need to be aware and to make the best choices we can for where we're at in the moment. So yeah, for sure.
Wow, well, that is a huge amount of information to take on board, and so valuable from so many aspects. So thank you so much for your time and for sharing all that knowledge with us. And I'm definitely looking up that book, the Woman's Brain book, and looking forward to having a read of it. So thanks for letting me know about that. But thank you, Kim. It has been an absolute pleasure having you on here, and I'm sure everybody has learned at least something new, but I'm sure lots of something new. So thank you.
Fantastic. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to when you've read that book so we can have some good discussions about it.
Yes, sounds good.
All right. Thank you, Vicky.
We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.